They thought I was just the logistics girl, until I quietly shut down $12 billion worth of cargo across 3 continents. One email ended my career, so I returned the favor by ending their company. Here's how I did it. My name is Rachel Lawson, and until 3 weeks ago, I was the Chief Systems Coordination Officer at Stratrum Dynamics. It's a fancy title that essentially meant I was responsible for keeping the global supply chain moving for some of the world's most critical industries, pharmaceuticals, defense contractors, consumer electronics giants. Few people understand what modern logistics actually means. It's not just trucks and boats and planes, it's a living, breathing digital nervous system that connects every warehouse, port, airport, and distribution center on the planet. And I built that nervous system from scratch. The system I created, OmniFlow, manages approximately 17% of all high-value cargo movement across the planet. That's $12 billion worth of goods in transit on any given day. I designed every layer of its architecture, from the biometric tracking codes embedded in shipping containers to the quantum-secured authentication protocols that keep it all running. And in one afternoon, they took it all away from me. My $900 million equity package set to vest in exactly 7 days vanished with a single email and a 30-minute meeting. The meeting where Darren Holt, our newly appointed CTO with the technical expertise of a houseplant, informed me that my position had been structurally optimized out of the organization. I didn't argue, I didn't cry. I simply smiled and said, "Good luck with that." They had no idea what was coming. Let me start from the beginning. 7 years ago, I was working at NASA's Logistics and Supply Chain Management Division. My job was ensuring critical components reached the International Space Station exactly when needed, not a day early, not an hour late. When lives depend on supply chain precision, you develop a certain attention to detail. That's when Thomas Keaton, the founder of a tiny Chicago startup called Stratrum Dynamics, reached out. 12 people working out of a converted warehouse space with a vision to revolutionize global logistics through AI-integrated tracking and routing. "I've read your paper on distributed node authentication for mission-critical supply chains," he said during our first meeting. "We need someone who thinks at your level." The vision was compelling: a unified digital platform that could track, route, and authenticate any physical shipment anywhere on the planet, with unbreakable security and perfect efficiency. The problem: no one had ever built anything like it before. I took the job, sold my condo in Houston, moved to Chicago, and dove into what would become the most important project of my life. The technical challenges were enormous. We weren't just building software. We were creating an entirely new paradigm for how physical goods move around the planet. The core of the system was what I called the trust chain, a distributed authentication protocol that verified every node in the network using a complex series of biometric identifiers and quantum-secured keys. The genius of it was that it worked even when disconnected from central servers, allowing containers to maintain their security profiles even in the middle of the ocean. But I knew from my NASA days that any system is only as secure as its governance structure. Technical brilliance means nothing without proper authorization controls. So I quietly built in a feature called Trust Lock, a dead man switch that required dual authentication from both me and an approved government representative for any critical system changes. The team knew about it, of course. It was documented in the technical specs. But as the years passed and the company grew from 12 people to over 900, that particular safeguard became buried under layers of documentation that nobody at the executive level bothered to read. By year 3, OmniFlow was handling shipping routes for 3 Fortune 500 companies. By year 5, we'd signed contracts with the Department of Defense, the NHS in Britain, and Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industry. Our technology had become critical infrastructure for global commerce. That's when Eagle Creek Holdings, a private equity firm with more money than technical understanding, made an offer to acquire a controlling stake in the company. Thomas, exhausted after years of 18-hour days, agreed to the acquisition. He took his billions and moved to New Zealand, leaving us in the hands of our new owners. The first red flag appeared during the all-hands meeting where they introduced Angela Price, our new CEO. Stradium isn't just a logistics company, she announced to the assembled staff. We're a data company that happens to move physical goods. The real value is in the information we control. I exchanged glances with Holly Marsden, our head of security. We both understood the implications. Eagle Creek didn't understand or care about the critical infrastructure we'd built. They saw us as a data mining operation that could be monetized. The second red flag was Darren Holt, our new CTO. His background was in digital transformation consulting, which seemed to mean he was excellent at creating PowerPoint presentations about technology he didn't understand. During our first one-on-one meeting, he referred to OmniFlow as basically Google Maps for shipping containers, and suggested we should streamline the authentication processes to make the system more user-friendly. The authentication processes are what make the system secure. I explained, we're not tracking pizza deliveries. We're handling pharmaceutical components, military equipment, and critical infrastructure supplies. Security isn't optional. He smiled that consultant smile, the one that says, I'm pretending to listen while thinking about my bonus, and made a note on his iPad. I appreciate your perspective. Rachel, we'll take it under advisement. The marginalization happened gradually. First, I was removed from the technology planning meetings. Then my team was reorganized, with my direct reports now answering to one of Darren's former colleagues from his consulting days. My access to certain development environments was revoked for security standardization. I watched as they systematically dismantled the carefully constructed governance structures we'd built, replacing them with more agile approaches that prioritize speed over security. When I raised concerns, I was told that I was being resistant to change and not embracing the company's new direction. Then came the IPO announcement. Stradium would go public in 3 months, with an expected valuation of $17 billion. My equity granted when I joined as employee number 13 would be worth approximately $900 million at the projected share price. All I had to do was stay employed for 3 more months. I tried to play the game. I smiled through meetings where technical decisions were made by people who couldn't explain the difference between a load balancer and a database. I bit my tongue when Darren proudly announced the OmniFlow 2.0 initiative that would revolutionize the platform I'd already built by adding features that already existed but that he'd never bothered to learn about. 1 week before my equity was set to vest, I received a calendar invitation for a meeting with Darren and Melissa from HR. The subject line simply read, Organizational Update. I knew what was coming. The meeting was brief and clinical. Stradium was undergoing a technical reorganization to streamline decision-making processes. My position was being eliminated. They'd value my contributions to building the company, but were moving in a new strategic direction. I would receive 2 months severance and health insurance coverage. My employee stock options just 7 days from vesting would be forfeited as per the terms of my employment agreement. Darren couldn't quite meet my eyes as he delivered the news. Melissa from HR handed me a manila folder containing termination paperwork and information about Cobra Health Insurance. I should also mention, Darren added, that we've implemented the system modifications we discussed previously. The trust lock protocols have been removed from the production environment. The system is fully under our control now. I almost laughed out loud. He genuinely believed that by changing a few configuration settings in the admin console, he'd disabled the core security architecture of the system. It was like thinking you could redesign a skyscraper by rearranging the furniture. I understand, I said calmly. Is there anything else? They seemed surprised by my lack of reaction. No tears, no arguments, no desperate negotiations. We'll need your company laptop and access card before you leave the building, Melissa said. And you'll need to sign this NDA reaffirmation. She slid another document across the table. I signed without reading it. It didn't matter. I had no intention of revealing company secrets. What I was planning wasn't about disclosure, it was about architecture. Good luck, I said as I stood to leave. You're going to need it. I handed over my laptop and badge at the security desk, nodded to the guard I'd known for years, and walked out of the building for the last time. The Chicago spring air felt unusually crisp that morning. I felt lighter somehow, unburdened. They thought they'd taken everything from me. They were wrong. When you build a system from its foundation, you understand its architecture in ways that no documentation can ever capture. I knew OmniFlow not as a collection of code and servers, but as a living organism with its own logic and rhythms. And I knew exactly how it would respond when its core trust assumptions were violated. I walked to a small coffee shop 3 blocks from the office, ordered an Americano, and opened my personal laptop. I connected to a secure server I'd maintained since the earliest days of the project, a completely legitimate backup system that contained architectural documentation and system logs that I was fully authorized to access as the system's chief architect. Darren had indeed made changes to the user interface that controlled TrustLock. What he didn't understand was that TrustLock wasn't a feature, it was the foundation of the entire authentication framework. Disabling it from the admin panel was like trying to remove a building's foundation by repainting the lobby. I accessed the secure command interface, still fully operational despite Darren's modifications, and entered a series of authentication codes. The system recognized me immediately. I had 72 hours before my credentials would be fully purged from the authentication servers as part of the standard offboarding process. I didn't need to inject any malicious code or create a backdoor. The system was already designed to protect itself from exactly the kind of unauthorized architectural changes that Darren was attempting. All I needed to do was set the clock running. I created what's called a deadman authentication protocol. If I didn't log in and verify my identity within 72 hours, the system would automatically assume that an authentication compromise had occurred. It wouldn't shut down, that would be too obvious and potentially damaging to the customers who depended on it. Instead, it would gradually enter what I called passive lockdown mode. In passive lockdown, existing shipping routes and authentication protocols would continue to function normally, but no new routes could be created, no new authentication certificates could be issued, and no system modifications could be implemented. The system would essentially freeze in place, continuing to operate but refusing to evolve. For a dynamic global logistics network, this was equivalent to a human body experiencing progressive paralysis. Everything would seem normal at first, but over the course of days and weeks, the inability to adapt to changing conditions would cause the entire system to grind to a halt. I closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and went home to wait. The first signs of trouble appeared exactly 76 hours after I implemented the protocol. A shipping container filled with pharmaceutical components in Singapore couldn't receive its updated routing instructions. A fleet of autonomous delivery vehicles in Rotterdam refused to accept new destination coordinates. A shipment of specialized electronics components destined for a defense contractor in Virginia remained locked in a secure holding facility, its authentication certificates awaiting verification. Small problems, easily attributed to routine system glitches. The kind of minor issues that occur in any complex technical environment. But they didn't stay small for long. By day 5, Stradium's technical support lines were overwhelmed with calls from frustrated customers experiencing authentication anomalies and routing verification errors. The company's stock price, which had been steadily climbing in anticipation of the IPO, began to falter as rumors of technical instability spread through industry channels. On day 7, the day my equity would have vested, the system entered full passive lockdown. No new shipments could be initiated anywhere in the network. Existing shipments continued to move, but couldn't be rerouted or modified in any way. The entire system had become a digital glacier, massive, immovable, and slowly grinding everything in its path to a halt. I watched it all unfold from the comfort of my apartment, tracking the cascading failures through industry news sites and the frantic messages being exchanged on logistics forums. I didn't feel satisfaction exactly. Too many innocent people were being affected by the disruption, but I did feel a sense of vindication. They had treated the system I'd built as a toy to be casually disassembled. Now they were learning the true cost of that arrogance. On day 9, I received an email from Angela Price. Rachel, we need to discuss the current system issues urgently. Please call me at your earliest convenience. We're prepared to offer a consulting arrangement at $2,000 per hour for your assistance in resolving these matters. I didn't respond. On day 12, another email arrived, this time with urgent system crisis in the subject line. The consulting rate had increased to $10,000 per hour. A contract was attached, along with a personal note from Angela. Rachel, I understand there may have been some unfortunate misunderstandings regarding your separation from Stradium. I want to assure you that we highly value your expertise and contributions to the company. The board has authorized me to discuss potential arrangements for your return in a senior technical capacity, including accelerated vesting of your equity package. Please call me as soon as you receive this message. I deleted the email without responding. By day 14, the situation had become a full-blown crisis. Over $4 billion in goods were stuck in various stages of the supply chain. Pharmaceutical companies were warning of potential medication shortages. Defense contractors were missing critical delivery deadlines. Consumer electronics giants were watching their carefully orchestrated product launches implode as components sat immobile in ports and warehouses around the world. Stradium's stock had fallen by 30% since the problems began. Financial analysts were questioning whether the company's technology was fundamentally flawed. The IPO, once expected to be one of the largest of the year, was now in serious jeopardy. That's when I received a text message from Holly Marsden, the security chief who'd been with the company almost as long as I had. Coffee tomorrow, 10 a.m. at Sawyer's on Michigan AV, eyes. I replied with a simple, yes. Holly was waiting when I arrived at the coffee shop the next morning. She looked tired but composed. Her usual impeccable suit replaced by jeans and a sweater, no longer representing the corporate image. They fired me yesterday, she said after we'd ordered. Said I should have prevented whatever's happening to the system. As if anyone could prevent an architectural response to fundamental authentication violations. I nodded but said nothing. They brought in a team from McKinsey to diagnose the problem, she continued. These consultants are running around talking about network topology optimization, while the entire system is clearly in passive lockdown mode. It would be funny if it weren't affecting so many people. She took a sip of her coffee and looked at me directly. I'm not going to ask if you triggered this because I know how TrustLock works. This is exactly what the system was designed to do if someone tried to remove its core security architecture. The question is, what are you planning to do next? I considered her question carefully. Holly was one of the few people who truly understood the system's design philosophy. She had helped implement many of the security protocols that were now paralyzing Stradium's operations. I'm starting a new company, I said finally. Lockright Systems, based in Denver. I've secured initial funding and office space. We'll be building a next-generation logistics security framework based on distributed authentication and responsibility verification. Holly nodded slowly, a small smile forming at the corners of her mouth. When do you need a chief security officer? As soon as you can start. She extended her hand across the table. I believe I'm available immediately. By the end of that week, I had leased office space in a converted factory building in Denver's Rhino district. The irony of moving from one converted warehouse to another wasn't lost on me. History had a way of rhyming. Word spread quickly through Stradium's engineering ranks. Within days, I'd received messages from 8 former colleagues, all senior engineers who understood the system's architecture, expressing interest in joining Lockright. I hired them all, along with 4 talented security specialists Holly recommended from her professional network. Meanwhile, Stradium's crisis continued to deepen. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story about the digital paralysis affecting global supply chains. The Department of Defense issued a formal inquiry into the security and reliability concerns surrounding the company's technology. Pharmaceutical giants began publicly announcing they were exploring alternative logistics providers. On day 21, Darren Holt resigned as CTO. His LinkedIn profile quickly updated to describe his time at Stradium as a strategic advisory role rather than a leadership position. Angela Price made a desperate appearance on CNBC, assuring investors that the company was implementing comprehensive solutions to address temporary system constraints. The market wasn't convinced. Stradium's stock fell another 15% that day. On day 28, I received a different kind of email, this one from Admiral James Richardson at the Department of Defense Logistics Agency. Ms. Lawson, I understand you've established a new venture focusing on secure supply chain management. The DoD is currently reassessing its logistics partnerships in light of recent industry developments. We would be interested in discussing potential collaboration opportunities. Please contact my office at your convenience to arrange a meeting. Similar messages arrive from pharmaceutical consortiums, critical infrastructure managers, and international trade organizations, all looking for alternatives to the increasingly unreliable Stradium platform. I didn't take pleasure in Stradium's collapse. Too many good people, former colleagues who had nothing to do with the decisions that led to my termination, were affected by the company's implosion. But I also recognized that what was happening wasn't just about my personal grievance. It was the inevitable result of treating critical infrastructure as a disposable asset to be manipulated for short-term financial gain. On day 35, Eagle Creek Holdings announced it was selling its controlling stake in Stradium to Global Transport, the company's largest competitor. The sale price represented a 70% loss on their initial investment. Angela Price was removed as CEO, replaced by a turnaround specialist with a background in corporate bankruptcy management. By then, Lockrite Systems had grown to 27 employees working out of our Denver headquarters. We had secured seed funding from a consortium of venture capital firms with experience in critical infrastructure and were deep in the development of our first product, a distributed authentication framework for high-security supply chains. 6 months later, I stood at a podium at the National Defense Logistics Conference in Washington, D.C. The audience included military officers, government officials, and executives from the world's largest logistics and supply chain companies. I was there to unveil Lockrite's new security architecture, a system designed from the ground up to resist the kind of centralized control that had ultimately doomed Stradium. The most dangerous vulnerability in any critical system isn't a technical flaw. I told the assembled crowd, it's the assumption that security can be subordinated to convenience, that authentication can be simplified without consequences, that control can be centralized without creating catastrophic single points of failure. I paused, looking out at the sea of attentive faces. At Lockrite, we believe that true security comes from distributed responsibility, from systems that are designed to resist not just external attacks, but internal subversion, from authentication frameworks that protect themselves against the very people who claim to control them. In the back of the room, I spotted a familiar face, Thomas Keaton, the original founder of Stradium, who had flown in from New Zealand specifically for this presentation. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod of approval. The global supply chain isn't just a commercial mechanism, I continued. It's the circulatory system of modern civilization. It delivers medicine to the sick, food to the hungry, and critical components to the infrastructure that powers our world. Its security isn't optional, it's existential. I clicked to the final slide of my presentation, a simple schematic showing the distributed trust model at the heart of Lockrite's new system. We're not building a product. We're building an architecture of trust, one that can't be compromised by a single point of failure or a single point of control. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. As I stepped away from the podium, my phone vibrated with a notification. Lockrite had just received its first major contract award, a $2.9 billion agreement with the Department of Defense to develop and implement the next generation of secure logistics infrastructure. I allowed myself a small smile as I walked off the stage. They had thought I was just the logistics girl. They had believed they could discard me and claim the value I'd created. They had assumed that control was something that could be taken rather than earned. They had been wrong on all counts. In the end, I hadn't frozen Stradium's supply chain out of vengeance. I had simply allowed the system to protect itself, to respond as it was designed to respond when its core trust assumptions were violated. The fact that this response had destroyed the company wasn't my doing. It was the inevitable consequence of trying to subvert a system you didn't understand. As Thomas approached me after the presentation, his expression was both impressed and slightly amused. "Trust lock," he said quietly. "I always wondered if it would ever be activated." "You knew about it all along?" I asked, surprised. He smiled. "I read the technical documentation, all of it, unlike some people." I laughed for what felt like the first time in months. What you're building now, he continued, gesturing toward the presentation screen where the Lockright logo still glowed. It's what we always intended Stradium to be, a system designed to serve its purpose regardless of who claims to own it. I nodded. Not a product to be bought and sold, an infrastructure to be respected and maintained. Precisely. He extended his hand. If you ever need additional investment or strategic guidance, I'd be honored to contribute. As we shook hands, I felt a sense of completion. The circle had closed. What Eagle Creek and their appointed executives had destroyed was being reborn, stronger and more resilient than before. They had fired me days before my equity vested, thinking they were simply optimizing their cap table before an IPO. They hadn't realized they were triggering a dead man switch that would bring their entire operation crashing down. I hadn't set out to destroy Stradium. I had simply built a system that could not be compromised without consequences and then allowed those consequences to unfold naturally when the attempt was made. In the end, that was my real revenge, not the company's collapse, but the vindication of the principles I'd fought for all along. The proof that in a world of critical systems, security isn't a feature to be added or removed at convenience. It's the foundation everything else depends on. As I walked out of the conference hall that day, surrounded by potential partners and clients eager to work with Lockright, I felt no lingering bitterness towards Stradium or its fallen executives. They had already faded into irrelevance, cautionary examples in business school case studies about the dangers of technical arrogance and short-term thinking. I had moved on to building something better, something that couldn't be taken away. And that was worth far more than $900 million in stolen equity. They thought I was just the logistics girl. They were wrong. I was the system itself. And systems, when properly designed, protect themselves.